My name is Isabel Marsh. Everyone calls me Bella. I'm 33 years old. I work as a pediatric surgeon in Portland, Oregon, and 3 weeks ago at my younger sister's rehearsal dinner, my own mother introduced me to the Groom's family with one sentence. "This is Bella. She used to do some nannying, cleans up nice, doesn't she?" I stood there in a dress I'd chosen, carefully holding a glass of champagne, and watched the groom's father go completely still across the table, staring at me like he was trying to place a face he already knew. I want to tell you why he was staring, because by the end of that night, he was the one who stood up and corrected my mother in front of everyone. Before I get into it, if your own family has ever shrunk you down to a version of yourself that stopped being true years ago, this story is for you. Subscribe if that resonates, and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from tonight, because I genuinely love reading through all of them. I should explain the nanny thing first, because it's not entirely a lie, just a version of the truth my mother has kept frozen in time for 15 years. When I was 19, working my way through undergrad, I spent 2 summers and 1 full gap year nannying for a family in Lake Oswego to help pay my own tuition, since my parents had made it clear early on that my younger sister Claire's activities, competitive gymnastics, private coaching, took priority in the family budget. I don't say that with bitterness anymore, just as fact. I worked. I paid my own way through college, then medical school, then a surgical residency that ran 7 brutal years, then a pediatric surgery fellowship. I've been an attending surgeon at a children's hospital in Portland for 4 years now. My mother knows all of this. She's been to my white coat ceremony. She has a photo of my residency graduation on her own refrigerator. And yet, at every family gathering for the past decade, the story that gets told to new people is always the same. Bella used to be a nanny. I've asked her about it exactly twice in my adult life, gently without accusation. Both times, she waved it off. It's just easier to explain, honey, people understand nannying. I stopped asking after the second time because I understood finally that it was never really about ease of explanation. Claire has always been the daughter my mother wanted to talk about, the one whose achievements got the full detailed telling. My own life, somewhere along the way, got compressed into a single, flattering-sounding but wildly outdated line, one that made me sound sweet and simple, rather than someone who spends her days doing reconstructive surgery on newborns. Claire's wedding was, by every account, going to be a beautiful one. She met her fiancé, Grant Whitfield, 2 years ago, and his family runs a regional hospital network across 3 states, old money, mixed with genuine philanthropy. The kind of family whose name is on hospital wings and university buildings. The rehearsal dinner was held at a restored estate outside Portland. String lights, a string quartet, the full picture. I flew in from a conference in Chicago that same afternoon, landing with just enough time to change and get to the venue, still slightly jet-lagged, still mentally replaying a difficult case from earlier that week. I want to walk you through the exact moment because I've replayed it more times than I can count. My mother was standing near the entrance with Grant's parents, Richard and Eleanor Whitfield, making introductions as guests arrived. I walked up, and my mother turned to me with the same practiced warmth she uses for photographs. "Richard, Eleanor, this is my older daughter, Bella. She used to do some nannying, cleans up nice, doesn't she?" I felt my face go hot in that specific way it does when you're being described to strangers as smaller than you actually are. I opened my mouth to correct it gently, the way I usually do some version of, "Actually, I'm a pediatric surgeon now," but before I could say a single word, I noticed Richard Whitfield's expression change. He wasn't smiling politely the way you do when you're being introduced to your future daughter-in-law's older sister. He was staring at me, genuinely, staring. His eyes narrowed slightly, the specific look of a man trying to place a face against a memory he can't quite locate. "I'm sorry," he said slowly, "have we met before? If you're already curious, stay with me because it gets much more interesting before it resolves. And if this is hitting close to home for you, drop a comment and let me know, because I genuinely read every single one." I told him I didn't think so, though something about his face felt faintly familiar in a way I couldn't place either the particular déjà vu of a stranger's features. My mother, sensing an opportunity to move the conversation along before I said anything that contradicted her introduction, laughed lightly and steered them toward the next group of arriving guests. Richard glanced back at me twice more over his shoulder before he was fully pulled away. I found a quiet corner near the bar and let out a slow breath the way I've trained myself to do over the years whenever my mother does this particular thing in front of new people. I told myself it didn't matter. I told myself I'd corrected worse before and would correct it again before the night was over. Dinner started, toasts were made, Claire glowing in a way that made me genuinely happy for her despite everything. I was seated 3 chairs down from Richard Whitfield, close enough to notice him glancing my way more than once throughout the meal, that same searching expression each time. Halfway through dinner, during a lull while the caterers cleared plates, Richard leaned over toward me. "Forgive me for staring earlier," he said quietly, "but I have this nagging feeling I've seen your face somewhere important and I genuinely can't place it. Do you work with children at all?" I told him plainly that I was a pediatric surgeon at Dernbecker Children's Hospital. His entire expression shifted and I watched him set down his fork slowly. "Dornbecker," he repeated. "What's your specialty there?" "Pediatric reconstructive and trauma surgery," I said. He went quiet for a long moment, studying my face again, and then he said something that made the noise of that entire dinner fade into the background for me. 8 months ago. A 4-year-old boy came in after a car accident, severe abdominal trauma emergency surgery in the middle of the night. Dr. Marsh. He said my last name slowly like he was testing it against a memory. "That was my grandson. That was you." I want to pause here and ask you something because I've thought about this moment constantly since. Have you ever had someone recognize a version of you that your own family refuses to see? Tell me in the comments because it's a strange, specific kind of validation I wasn't prepared for that night. I remembered the case the moment he said it, the way surgeons remember certain nights more clearly than others. A 4-year-old ruptured spleen internal bleeding, a 3-hour surgery that ended thankfully with a full recovery. I hadn't connected the last name at the time, and children's names rarely stay attached to family names you'd recognize at a dinner party months later. "That's my grandson, Oliver." Richard said, his voice thick with something I can only describe as disbelief, mixed with a kind of quiet reverence. "My daughter has told that story a dozen times about the surgeon who saved his life at 3 a.m. We never actually learned your first name properly. Everyone just called you Dr. Marsh. I've been trying to place your face all evening and I finally have." He turned then, and I watched him look directly across the table at my mother, who had been half listening to this exchange with growing confusion. "Diane," he said, his voice carrying now clear and deliberate in a way that pulled several nearby conversations to a stop. "You introduced your daughter to me an hour ago as someone who used to do some nannying. I need you to understand who I've actually been sitting next to tonight." I want to be honest that I hadn't expected him to say anything at all, let alone say it loudly enough for half the table to hear. My mother's face went through several stages very quickly: confusion, then a kind of scrambling politeness. "Well, she did nanny for a family years ago. It's just a fun fact about her, that's all." Richard didn't let it go, and I found myself watching a stranger do something I'd stopped expecting anyone in my own family to do. 8 months ago, your daughter performed emergency surgery on my grandson in the middle of the night and saved his life. She is one of the finest pediatric surgeons in this state, and you introduced her to me tonight like she waits tables on the weekend. I don't say this to embarrass you, Diane. I say it because I think your family owes her a much better introduction than the one I got. The table had gone properly quiet by that point. Claire looking between our mother and me with an expression I hadn't seen on her face before, something between confusion and dawning realization. My father, who rarely says much at these gatherings, set down his glass and looked at me directly for what felt like the first time all evening. My mother, flustered now, tried to recover. "I didn't mean anything by it, it's just how I've always described it. It's a sweet story." I finally spoke as calmly as I could manage, though my hands were not entirely steady. "Mom, it hasn't been a sweet story in over a decade. I finished my residency 6 years ago. I've been operating on children for 4 years. You've had a photo of my white coat ceremony on your own refrigerator this whole time." Claire, to her genuine credit, looked at our mother and asked the question that mattered most in that moment. "Mom, why do you always introduce her like that? You never do it to embarrass her, but you never once correct it either." My mother didn't have an answer for that, not a real one. She said something about habit, about it being easier, the same explanation she'd given me twice before, except now it was being tested in front of the exact family she'd been trying to impress all evening. Eleanor Whitfield, who had been quiet through most of this, reached over and touched my hand gently. "I'd love to actually hear about your work if you're willing to tell me properly this time. I want to tell you what happened in the rest of that dinner because it mattered almost as much as the moment itself." Richard spent the remainder of the evening asking me genuine questions about pediatric surgery, about Oliver's recovery, about the residency I'd completed, treating me for the first time at any family event in years, like the person I had actually spent 15 years becoming. My mother stayed quiet for most of the rest of the night, occasionally glancing my way with an expression I couldn't quite read, somewhere between embarrassment and something that might have been the beginning of genuine reflection. The wedding itself 2 days later went smoothly. Claire looked beautiful, Grant looked overjoyed, and my mother, during her own Mother of the Bride toast, made a point unprompted of mentioning that her older daughter was a brilliant pediatric surgeon who saves children's lives every single day the first time, in longer than I could remember that she'd said it plainly without a single qualifier attached to soften it or make it smaller. I didn't get a tearful, dramatic apology afterward, and I want to be honest about that, rather than pretend the story wrapped up perfectly. My mother and I had one quiet conversation a week later where she admitted haltingly that she genuinely didn't know why she'd kept telling the nanny version for so long, except that maybe somewhere underneath it, it had felt safer to describe a daughter who needed less explaining, one whose accomplishments didn't sit quite so far outside what she understood. Here's where things stand now. My mother has slowly started introducing me differently at the few gatherings we've had, since still occasionally slipping back into old habits, but catching herself now correcting it out loud when she does. Richard Whitfield and his family have stayed in touch genuinely, not out of obligation, but out of what feels like real warmth. And Oliver, now 5, drew me a picture at Claire's wedding reception that's currently taped to my office door at the hospital. If there's one thing I want you to take from this, it's this. Sometimes the people who see you most clearly aren't the ones who raised you. Sometimes it takes a stranger staring across a dinner table trying to place a face they already respected to finally say out loud what your own family should have been saying for years. If this reminded you of a version of yourself your family has never quite let go of, share this with someone who'd understand. Tell me in the comments, has anyone outside your family ever seen you more clearly than the people who raised you did? And if you want more stories like this one, subscribe because there's a lot more where this came from. I'll see you in the next one.